I am very excited to introduce Adam Ratner and Blair Bazdaritch. They are going to be doing a session called The Case for Optimism, Communicating Solutions and Providing Hope. And they'll be sharing some tested communication tools that will promote community engagement in sustainability solutions. And they'll be tying in examples from today's presentations to show how to frame sustainability projects and programs as part of broader community level climate change solutions. So I will introduce them. Adam is the Associate Director of Conservation Education at the Marine Mammal Center, the world's largest marine mammal hospital and education facility. He also serves as the chair of the training committee for the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation and the executive chair of the Bay Area Climate Literacy Impact Collaborative. Blair Bazdaritch is the Education and Engagement Manager at the San Francisco Zoo and Gardens, overseeing outreach programming and teen volunteers, and sits on the executive committee for the National Network and Ocean Climate Change Interpretation, NOCI. In her spare time, she is the resident zoologist on the podcast This Week in Science, or TWIST. So without further ado, I will let Adam and Blair take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So for those that I haven't had a chance to meet on the call, I am at the Marine Mammal Center, if you couldn't tell from my background. And really, for the last 11 years, what I've been trying to do is connect the science of ocean health, whether that's climate change, whether that's things like overfishing, ocean trash, to the science of communication on those issues. So just knowing the science, we know isn't really the key to behavior change, and it's how we talk about that. So what I'll have a chance to do is share a little bit of the data that we know that's happening kind of around the country and around the world on behavior change. And then Blair, I'll give a chance to introduce herself. We'll be able to talk about some of this kind of social science research on solutions. And then we'll have a chance to kind of highlight just between the two of us some of the key takeaways we found, and then open it up for questions as well. But I'll let Blair share a little bit more about herself.
Sure. So I actually started working at the San Francisco Zoo when I was a teenager. I started as a teen volunteer there. And over the years, I've been a zookeeper. I worked at an aquarium. I've been a pub quiz host. I've done a million things, but ultimately it all came down to a love of animals, and then a love of education, and from there, a love of science and conservation. And so my current career goals are directly related to communicating climate change and other conservation issues effectively, and creating a community for people interested in conservation and the natural world.
So we're going to try out between the two of us co-leading a virtual workshop. So this should be fun. What I'll kind of share just to get us started is when we think about all of the stuff that we've heard today. You've heard from close to a dozen people or so around all the action that's happening around the Bay Area and around the globe that hopefully has given you some reason for optimism and hope. And we'll kind of boil down some key takeaways from all of those over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. And I wanted to start with just a quote from a guy by the name of Mal Pancoast, and he really gets no attention for anything else except for this quote, but I do absolutely love it. He says, "The odds of hitting your target go up dramatically when you aim at it." And I think that's something for us to keep in mind as we think about our stories that we're sharing around climate change or around recycling, whatever else it is, that just giving people the data, just giving people the knowledge isn't what's translating to action. So if you want them to do something, let's talk about it. Let's help give them that guidance. And you've heard some amazing solutions already so far today. And it's not just giving people the solutions, but it's how we talk about it, how we frame it. So the idea of leading with positivity, leading with optimism makes a really big difference. So Elise Boulding said, if one is mentally out of breath all the time from dealing with the present, there's no energy left for imagining the future. So if we continue to give people more and more things to worry about, what we can lead to is people kind of filling up on this finite pool of worry. Instead of being motivated to take action, they kind of curl up, want to cry in the corner a little bit. So if we flip the script, it can make a really big difference. A group that I've followed for a long time at this point is Grist. They're kind of an online newspaper. And one of their major taglines is make the story of a better future so irresistible that people want it. Because that's what's going to drive the change. If you give people something to reach for, they're going to go for it. If you make them really concerned, really worried, you're going to see people kind of backing away a little bit, feeling overwhelmed perhaps. And we've seen this happen time and time again in the research on different conservation issues. So just a few years ago around climate change, they realized that those people that were more hopeful around climate change did more to solve climate change. It shouldn't be that surprising when we think about it, but it's a key thing when we think about the messaging of how we bring some of these huge topics of sustainability to the forefront. So thinking just about how we're talking about it and having that positive spin. We don't need to oversimplify things. We don't want to paint too rosy of a picture. Things like climate change are real, but instead of going that more crisis frame, if we help people see these solutions, we see that people are more willing to adopt them as they move forward in their daily lives. I also wanted to just highlight some kind of public perceptions around some of these issues, and particularly with climate change, that might come as a surprise to some of you. So when it comes to the people in the US, with climate change beliefs, what we've got is 69% of people, and in some places, up to around 80% of people believe that climate change and global warming is happening. Only 12% say it isn't. Now, to give you just some perspective on that, 7% of people in the US believe that chocolate milk only comes from brown cows. So that just helps give you a sense of what 12% means when we're thinking about this context. Now, with that being said, an overwhelming majority of people believe climate change is happening, but 59% of people rarely or never talk about it. So there's a spiral of silence. And if we're not talking about these issues, other people in our communities, in our networks, in maybe our kind of leaders within our communities, whether that is businesses, whether that is politics, whatever it might be, aren't hearing that we care about this. And it just perpetuates it. If you're not hearing about it, you're not willing to talk about it then because you don't think other people care. But when we actually ask people, we know that they do. To give you an even more stark contrast here, only 24% of people in the US hear about climate change from someone they know once a month or more. So what that means is 3 out of 4 people are not hearing about climate change each month. It seems crazy for those that are in our field. I see probably 20 or 30 things a day on climate change alone, not to mention plastics, not to mention overfishing. But for the kind of everyday people that have a lot of different competing needs, they're not hearing about this. And therefore, they're not necessarily thinking it's an issue that they should focus on or they should care about, because maybe it's just them that's feeling this way. By bringing it to the forefront, we're normalizing concern for the environment, concern for the climate. So it puts a little bit of pressure on us to talk about it, but it allows us to really move the needle in a big way because we're building that movement, momentum that's needed to tackle big issues like climate change. And all of these stats you can find on the Yale program on climate change communication. They are a fantastic resource for any public perception around things like climate change. Now, this is the kind of belief and talking about it action, but I wanted to share just a few other statistics with you as well to give you a sense of people's willingness to act. Because sometimes we think we're on our soapboxes trying to talk about all these things and people just don't want to hear it. The reality is that's not really true. So a study of national parks and wildlife refuges found 91% of visitors to those organizations were extremely willing or somewhat willing to change their behaviors to help reduce the impact of climate change. 91% of people going to those communities and those areas were willing to act. They might not know what to do. That's what we have to help share with them. Give them that guidance, give them that structure, but they're willing to act to help. They do care. When we look at groups like zoos and aquariums, other informal science centers, 75% of those visitors want recommendations and believe that we should be giving those recommendations to them around ways to protect the environment. They might not come out and just say it, but when we ask them, that's what they're looking for from us. And when we think about the audiences at those two places, alone. So if we take zoos and aquariums, what you've got is more people visiting zoos and aquariums in the US each year than every major sporting event combined in the US. Over 100 million people. You take the people that are joining national parks, state parks, you're looking at another 300 million people. So this is a huge audience that's willing to act if we empower them with the right solutions, the right messaging, make it relevant to them, we can actually create that change we're looking for. It goes on. When we look at some specific actions, 64% of Americans say no one's ever even asked them to eat more plant-based foods. But over half of them are willing to do it if they knew more about the impact. So again, simply bringing forward concrete solutions makes people realize that there's a reason for them to do it. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves for everything happening around the world. Sometimes we need that extra nudge or that extra info to know why what we're doing is important. That's what we can do as educators, as community leaders. And then you've got some of the impact of what they might do with their voice as it relates to voting, whether it's writing letters to their community leaders. This is a huge audience, over half of people willing to take action if they hear it from someone that they like and they respect. So this gives us the opportunity to really leverage a huge audience for the movement that we need. Now, one of the ways we can do that, and you heard from some of the different speakers today, is finding that common ground, finding that shared value for everybody. J.K. Galbraith once said, faced with a choice between changing one's mind and proving there's no need to do so, almost everyone gets busy with proof. We default to what our personal perceptions have been. And even though we might differ on tactics for things, we do come from kind of this shared community of values. And what's been wonderful is we can use social science to test particular values that are more likely to move people towards action and understanding on big global issues, like with climate change. So for example, the idea of responsible management, that this behavior, these actions matter because taking common sense steps today is in the interest of future generations. That has been scientifically tested to help make people more willing to believe and more willing to act on issues like climate change. And it can be boiled down into different types of messages, whether this is in things like tweets, whether this is in exhibit signage, whether this is in presentations. The idea that we should be responsible when it comes to taking care of the environment, that we can look ahead to handle problems before it gets worse, that responsible managers like us in our field look to evidence, take step-by-step approaches to solve the issues that are facing our environment and our world, and that future generations depend on the choices that we make right now. This is just one value, but there are others out there. The idea of protecting people and places from harm, identifying the co-benefits that come with these actions. You heard things around the co-benefits of health, the co-benefits of community building from some of the other speakers today. So starting at that place opens the door for people so that you're now speaking the same language, you're not kind of combative. And then as you reinforce these messages over the time you're talking with people, the more and more they realize that you're on the same team, and therefore you're more willing to move together to the solution. So this is one piece of that kind of conservation impact story. And I want to turn it over to Blair now to share how do we build on that and look towards the solution element to really hit the mark that we're aiming for here.
Absolutely. So we have started with perhaps the most important part of any conversation that we have with visitors, with family members, with stakeholders, with our bosses, whoever it is that we're trying to talk to about sustainability, which is, why do I care? Ultimately, if we don't start with that, without that value, without the start of kind of the reason to be invested, it's very easy to decide that other things are more important, or I don't have time, or I have to deal with this other thing first. So it creates the why, which is really important. But the next thing we have to worry about is making sure that we are not leaving anyone behind. And this is related to educational equity. This is related to reaching people where they are. But ultimately, we need to make sure that we explain every step between our carbon emissions or our waste production or whatever it is and what we're trying to get to, a proposal for a new sustainable method or a particular new policy that we are trying to promote. And so we need to make sure that each of those steps are explained and we're not leaving anyone behind. So we call that our explanatory chain. We have to explain every link in that chain from the beginning to the end. And it's very easy for us to assume that certain people know what certain things are, like what greenhouse gas is, but we never know where the cognitive holes lie. And sometimes just explaining things fully can bring people to the present and the most clear resolution to these problems that we are bringing up just by explaining the mechanism. And so sometimes people can come to their own ideas of solutions where we're trying to get them to on their own if we can explain things fully. So it's just a good reminder that data is great, projections are great. This is all a really important part of our field, but we need to make sure that all of those things are explained fully for whatever audience we're talking to. And the research has shown that people don't think you're talking down to them. If you model good explanatory behavior, then they can model that back later. So it's actually a really good way of not just including everyone in your conversation, but modeling good interpretation techniques and education techniques so that then those people can take them out later. The main thing I want to talk about, though, is how we're going to fix the problem that we then resolve. So I know from working with kids especially that you never, ever, ever want to bring up a problem without talking about solutions, because otherwise you're left feeling powerless. So if we're going to talk about a big, bad problem, we have to talk about big, heavy-duty solutions. And so we can provide guidance to help people to take actions that will make a big, impactful change for the future. I heard Adam trying to change the slide.
I am actively trying to change the
There we
slide,
go.
and somehow it didn't work for you, and it worked the whole time I was presenting. So I have all the power, clearly.
So let's talk about community level solutions. I think we all know that changing a light bulb is not going to solve climate change. And that is why community level solutions are so important, because they are the perfect nexus of things that everybody can participate in and things that will actually make an impact on our future. That little Venn diagram in the middle is community level solutions. How can we reach people where they are with solutions that they can actually take action on, that are reachable for them, but will create real impact for the future? And so that is by reaching things at a community level. So if we change kind of the context, that the way people think about how they can be sustainable people, so that it's not just what I'm going to do, it's how I'm going to engage my community in these larger solutions, we actually do see the needle moving in a real way. And we, of course, want to make it easy, because people don't do things that are hard if it's easier to sit around and do nothing. So community level solutions, they are evidence-based, of course. We love our science and our evidence-based programs here, and they address the problem we're talking about, which is really important, because if I'm talking about transportation-related carbon emissions, and then I start talking about recycling, there is a disconnect there. So when we are having a conversation about sustainability, we need to make sure that our subject, our why we're worried about it, our value, kind of the thing that we're focusing on, is related to the solution that we're bringing up. Because people will get confused and there'll be issues there. We can get caught in what we call the swamp, where kind of it's mucky and cloudy and people don't understand exactly what's going on if we don't make sure that our subject matter and our solution are linked. And even if it is linked, like climate change and recycling, you really have to explain those connections, because otherwise people get very confused unless you can really explain, I want to talk about the carbon emissions from the processing of waste. So then you can kind of talk about that, right? And ultimately, solutions are about hope. It gives us an idea that there is a better tomorrow that is a possibility out there. If we don't talk about these big level solutions, it can feel hopeless. And the way that the average person can help with these sustainable practices is by engaging into a community level action. It's even better if those already exist, of course, because then it's kind of a lighter lift for me to just go find this organization that already exists or sign this thing that already exists. It's definitely we want to remove as many barriers as we can to action, but it has to be higher level so that people can feel like they're really making a difference. Which brings us to hope. The case for optimism is what we were talking about at the very beginning here. It is so easy when we are talking about environmental education to want to kind of verbally or physically or virtually shake somebody by the shoulders and go, "Don't you understand? We're all gonna die." But there's a reason not to do that. I always think back to my childhood when I was being told that the rainforests were disappearing and it was all on fire and we were losing football fields of rainforest a day, and if you don't do anything, the rainforest will be gone. And that was the kind of original environmental education model. But we've discovered that unfortunately it doesn't create lasting change. That kind of crisis frame can create a very impactful single action, like a one-time donation. But if you want to completely change the way society works to make a better tomorrow, fear doesn't work. And it's because it leads to wariness, an unproductive attention to details, which I think is very interesting. And like, if you've ever gotten like panicked, I mean, recently, maybe because of certain things going on, you might start focusing on like, I can't find my favorite pencil. I can't do any work if I can't find my pencil, right? So it's there. If you're too afraid, your creativity shuts down. You focus in on these little details, and your risks, everything feels like worst case scenario. But if instead we focus on hope, that actually boosts creativity. It makes people excited or happy about a potential future. It creates a yearning that's actually really positive. It's something that people are anxious to get to, and it's a call to action. People are ready to go up in arms if they're hopeful, and ultimately it's a coping resource, which is pretty important. Actually, there was some research that came out pretty recently that said that environmental educators, I'm sure a lot of people in the room can relate to this. Environmental educators start to show, a lot of them, some of the symptoms of PTSD from many years in the field. That might sound silly for a second, but if you really start to think about it, it's there. And it's because a lot of environmental educators might feel like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulder. And it's because we too are kind of focused on this crisis frame, which is why hope is important, not just in our messaging to visitors, constituents, but it's also important for our messaging to ourselves and each other, which brings me to what I think is on the next slide. Yeah, so hope, it gives us a will and a way so that we can see a solution, inspire action, and it creates this direct and indirect impact on us and our work that we do. So of course, directly, it helps with our messaging. It creates the call to action. It's a real behavior change that people can get excited about and think towards. But indirectly, and this is what's so important, and I think is the hardest part about this, is that if we talk to visitors in the park and say, I can't wait to see what tomorrow will bring, we can do it, and then go back to the office and go, we're screwed with my coworker, it makes it not feel as genuine, but also it will shine through. So if we can be hopeful with each other, it will change the way that we do our work as well. And it'll boost all those things I just talked about, creativity and a yearning and motivation. It'll do that within our own facilities as well. So hope is a really important, and I know it sounds like, some people have said to me, well, so you're telling me not to tell the truth. No. As Adam mentioned, we still want to be realistic. We want to talk about real threats, but we also want to talk about real action. And I think that's the part that makes this so different, is that we don't want to spend 90% of our time talking about how we're going to be impacted and 10% of the time talking about what we're going to do about it. If you kind of flip that script, then the entire tone of your conversation, even though it might have similar content, becomes hopeful, because we're talking about options for change. So we want to be specific with those potential solutions that we're offering. The more concrete we can be, the easier it is for people to engage. And if we can use examples, like today, we got a bunch of examples of solutions that are currently working, you can use that as inspiration for future action and be extremely explicit about what people can do. Because if we just say we need more bike lanes and leave people to draw conclusions from there, they're gonna go, I don't know what to do about that. But if we say there's this proposition on our ballots this fall related to these bike lanes that we want to be built, or there's this organization that you can go join and help work together to build these bike-friendly streets or whatever, right? So you have to find something that's more specific and go back to that explanatory chain. Make sure that you are connecting your solution back to what's at stake, your responsible management value, or whatever it is that you want to talk about, your future generations, taking reasonable step-by-step ways of reducing future risk, and make sure that your solution is part central to that story and that we're all in this together. Don't say you, say we. It is a we problem and it is a we solution. Our concern for the environment is normal and we can work together to fix it. And, you know, for my entire career in environmental education, conservation ed, I've been saying, like, do this, do that, do this, do that. If you can't do anything else, tell a friend. And it kind of just felt like a throwaway consolation. But social science research has showed us that talking about it is actually the most impactful of all of the solutions we can offer to the average person, because of that spiral of silence that Adam was talking about. If people just talk about this stuff more, it will start to become second nature and our way of life will change. We want people talking about this stuff all the time, because remember, people want to talk about it, they're concerned about it, but they think they're the only one. So if we can normalize the concern and the conversation, it completely flips the script and we're not swimming upstream anymore. We're going with the current, which is where we want to go, towards a better tomorrow. Oh yeah, and avoid polarizing language. So the last one, thank you, Adam, I totally forgot about that one. It's really easy to throw politics in the mix. Super easy, especially now. But a better tomorrow means we need everybody. And the social science research shows us that it is possible to get everybody, because we all have similar unifying values. And we can actually find ways to engage everyone if we are careful about our language. If we use words right away that are going to make people feel excluded, they have no reason to listen to what we have to say. But if we talk about our community at a local level, if we talk about our city, if we talk about our state, if we talk about our neighborhood, if we talk about things that are unifying across these potential polar groups, then we have an opportunity to make a sustainable future something that everybody wants. It really is possible. So with that, I think Adam and I are gonna kind of debrief a little bit about what we've heard today. Do you want to kind of introduce that, Adam?
Yeah, so we'll save a little bit of time for questions as well, but we figured that just because this is how Blair and I also operate, we were going to surprise each other with some questions to just get kind of a recap of what are the things that we've seen so far today, since there were so many fantastic speakers and concepts brought forward, but also just around climate change and conservation communication. So we'll do probably one or two questions each to each other and then open it up for questions from all of you. And then I know that things are going to be open later past 3:30 as well. So we'll be able, personally, I'll be able to stay on the line a little bit longer if there are more questions. But I think I'll kick it off by giving you a question, Blair, which is, I think we're close to 6 hours in at this point today. What are some of maybe the 2 or 3 kind of nuggets that really resonated with you across the whole day that you're going to be able to utilize in your communications and share out with your constituents that you heard so far at the summit?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that I'm seeing kind of radiating conversations from all of our speakers, up, down, left, right, sideways. And I think that that's the thing that maybe hasn't always been the case, but we're seeing more and more of now. And I think it's what's most important is we need to be talking to people in our field. We need to be talking to people adjacent to our field. We need to be talking to people that aren't really related to our field at all. We need to be talking to bosses. We need to be talking to part-time employees. We need to be talking to community members. And I really loved how many people talked about engaging their local communities and making them part of the decision-making process, because it's something that I've been wrestling with a lot is the whole diversity, equity, and inclusion piece of sustainability, because it does sometimes feel like there are barriers that are in the way between certain people, just the average person, and people who want to live a green life. And I think that the more that we can meet people where they are, the more that we can start community roundtables or find out what people want and figure out how to synchronize our goals for sustainability with what communities want most. I think that is where our beautiful future is. And so I'm seeing a lot of that happening throughout our talks today. And yeah, it makes me feel pretty good, like we're moving in the right direction here.
Excellent.
So Adam, what I wanted to ask you is just, I think also because of that I took away from the day, I'm kind of building on that, is if you could look at yourself 5 years ago, or even better, 6 weeks ago, how do you think your conservation communication, your climate communication specifically, is different from then?
This is unfair. You asked me a harder question. So I'll start thinking about like me 10 years ago, for example. And I think things have shifted in the last 6 weeks as well. But I'll be honest, 10 years ago, I was talking about these things with the mindset that if I just give you the knowledge, you'll do something with it. And that is a way we've kind of operated in the education field for a long time, I would say. It's got a formal name in the psychology field, which is the knowledge deficit model. And unfortunately, it has been shown time and time again to just not work. So the more I would say climate change is a problem, we need to deal with it. Here's the data, things are rising, things are getting warmer, whatever it is, hoping that people would take it upon themselves then to find the solution, do it, talk about it. And it doesn't work. And it's a sad reality of how we operate, but I think it gives us clues then for how we can shift that, and really looking not just at the science of the issues, but the science of how we talk about them has been a major breakthrough in how I operate, and really thinking about leading with values, being explicit and providing that guidance and those next steps, thinking about who are we not talking to that we need to be talking to make a big difference. So I think that's been a big stepping stone, and we'll share a couple slides at the end that just give you some resources that you can follow up with that have been helpful to both me and Blair as we move forward. I think the other part that I'll mention is kind of how do we talk about climate change now within the COVID-19 context? And as we've all experienced, this is the context that we're in, and there's no moving around what is happening right now with COVID-19 for at least the foreseeable future. So our communications can't pretend, in a sense, that everything is the same as where it was 6 months ago. All of our communications need to be through that lens of where our audiences are right now with COVID. So being really mindful of how we're talking about things in a state where people have really kind of heightened tension and awareness and other issues that they're dealing with. I think it's also something where we can, in a sense, be really mindful about hitting COVID against the environment. We, I think, are tempted right now to find hope everywhere we're looking. I certainly know I am, but as we hear stories about animals retaking nature, as we hear stories of silver linings that carbon pollution, air pollution is getting better, I think we need to be really careful with that because it perpetuates a myth for a lot of people that the way we're going to solve climate change is doing what we're doing now. And that's terrifying. I absolutely don't want to solve climate change by sheltering in place for the rest of time and for however millions of people not having jobs and all the other elements that are out there. I think we can reframe it, though, to talk about how we've been able to come together as communities, and we've seen that happen in a really powerful, emotional way for good within this pandemic. I think we can also talk about the connections of how we are finding that connection to each other through this process. And that's going to be important as we take those next steps recovering from the pandemic. And the solutions for how we recover from COVID, I think, can mesh really nicely and not be a competition with climate change. We think about the increased active transportation that we've seen, the biking, the walking, and how that can lend to some really great solutions around bike and walk paths. Exactly what you saw Kieran talk about earlier today, which was so inspirational to me. We think about how we can support different groups and businesses that are taking action to reduce their carbon footprint. So whether that's through the stimulus bills and talking to our community leaders of how we can make sure that we get out of this better than where we were before it, is going to be a time for action and change, but just navigating those conversations really intentionally. And a thing that I heard from Kieran's talk, it was on one of his slides that I just absolutely love, is he described what he was doing as intensive and intentional community engagement. And I think that's really the key. Let's talk about it, be sensitive, make sure that we're doing it within the right context, but let's be really intentional about what we're looking for from those conversations as well. That's going to be something I'm practicing daily because we're entering a new world right now.
Definitely.
So I know we've got a few minutes left, so I think we'll leave it open to whatever questions have been coming in. I have not been able to see the chat box because I'm sharing my screen, but I'm going to go ahead and close out a couple of slides here. I'll just show you a few places that you can go to as people are monitoring the chat and putting their questions in. If you want some more information on our frameworks, Noki.org or climateinterpreter.org have some great blog posts, some of the social science that you can find behind the recommendations that we made. There's also a free online course available that you can go to. It's self-modulated that allows you to see some of those different options. And then you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter as well, which is the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation. And then you can always reach out to us as well. But what I'll go ahead and do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll take a few questions that have come up over the last few minutes or so.
Thank you so much, Adam and Blair. That was awesome. And Tanya has been monitoring the questions, so we definitely have a few. And I think you actually answered one of them about the resources, but take it away, Tanya.
Thank you, and thank you, Adam and Blair. And I certainly appreciate your ending comments, Adam, about hitting the virus and climate change. I think you did answer one of the questions that was asking about a script for common ways to spin a climate change issue into a positive way. And I know from just my use of Noki and those resources, some of that's up there. But if you want to comment on that, and kind of tagging along with that is how best to communicate community action ideas to youth and organizations working in low-income communities.
Yeah, that's a lot of things. So first I'll say, I think what I would like to remind people of when we talk about spinning climate change into a positive conversation, I have found in my time teaching volunteers and staff and interpreters about how to have climate change conversations that people expect it to be like 50-50 positive to negative conversations. Like they expect to bring up the words climate change and bam, somebody's mad and got their finger in their face. But that has happened like maybe twice in the past more than decade I've been talking about this. So I think there's a very different expectation for how these conversations can and will go than what happens in reality. And I think that if you start with a hopeful tone about common sense, practical steps for a better world for future generations, is about that your tone and starting with that value statement, you depolarize the conversation right away. But you know, there's a lot more in-depth information on how to practice doing that and all that kind of stuff on Noki.org. And in fact, we actually do have some crash courses coming up in the fall. So there'll be some intensive training opportunities that way as well. And I'll just answer about youth too. It's about finding what somebody's community is, because it depends how old the kid is and what situation they're in. This could relate to low-income communities as well. It depends how people identify as a community. It could be their family, it could be their classroom, it could be their school, it could be their community center, it could be their church, it could be anything. But that's the beauty of the community level solution, is when it's more than just you, suddenly your impact is like a ripple effect. And so you can have a larger and larger impact with your action for sustainability. So I think it's all just kind of recognizing what their sphere of influence is and going from there.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add on to that using some explicit case studies as well to show the impact that youth have had, because youth have been invaluable in moving forward some major initiatives. You think about Oakland Unified School District having Meatless Monday programs because students wanted it and talked about it. No idling zones at schools. Even things like putting solar onto roofs at schools around the country were started by students at those schools, realizing that they've got a great community. And then you think about the whole movement that's been happening with student strikes and students making their voices heard to all of their community leaders. It really does speak a lot to the power that that audience has, but they might not realize they have that power just because of all the communication going out. So reinforcing that is really helpful.
It's a great comment. Another question, and I just also wanted your mention of using case studies of what students have done. Are examples of those on the Noki website or any other place? Because I think sometimes we don't know those examples, and I think you're right, they are very powerful.
It's fantastic you asked that. One of the collaboratives that I serve as the executive chair of, and Laura and Blair and a few others on this call are, is the Bay Area Climate Literacy Impact Collaborative. And that's actually what we're working on this year, is putting together all of those resources. So I certainly have some now, but what we're looking to is getting some input, building a matrix, the toolbox that has those messaging. So what I would encourage is reach out to me if you want to be involved in those conversations moving forward. My email address is Ratner, R-A-T-N-E-R, and then A is in Adam, at tmmc.org. You can also go to www.bayclick.org and see some information. We're in the period of transition with it, so there's not as much on the website, but you'll be able to sign up for a newsletter that makes sure that you get some of this information moving forward.
I'll also say, if you're looking for sources of hope and examples of solutions, that in January 2016, Noki started something called 100 Days of Hope. And it's a little further back now, but it's on Facebook and Twitter. And there's almost 400 Noki members. And we had posts from across the country with little tidbits of hope and information about community efforts and research and other things going on that gave people hope in relation to climate change throughout those 100 days. So that is a good kind of bank of those things as well.
Great, thank you. I think we're out of time, but Laura, if we have time for just one more quick question.
Sure.
Somebody
Yeah,
was asking Adam.
Go ahead.
Somebody was asking Adam whether he recommends the Communicating Climate Change, a Guide for Educators from Cornell in 2018.
I sure do. Yes, I have a case study in that, and it talks about using Noki. It's one of the best published resources that I've seen, not a scientific article, but an actual book. And I worked with all the different authors and contributors on that through the North American Association for Environmental Education. And it really paints a mosaic of approaches. So every audience is a little bit different, whether it's students, whether it's through religious groups, whether it's college students, different forms of communities. So there's a lot of great resources, and it's absolutely free online. What I can do is try and quickly pull up the online link and put it in the chat box.
Great, thank you very much.
Yes.
You're getting a lot of kudos for your talk and your work, but no more actual questions right now.
Can I plug one last thing?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that what I would hope some people would take away from our little session here is that you can find your own source of hope, because in Noki all the time we talk about, you have to put on your own oxygen mask before you help others. So in this case, find what makes you hopeful. And in my case, that is the Noki network. So I found a network that I'm really active in, and they provide me my hope most days. It might be a particular website that posts feel-good stories. It might be a colleague that can kind of bring you kind of up, fuel you up. But look for those collaboratives, look for those networks, and look for colleagues that you can work together to fill that kind of vessel of hope for yourself, so that you can then provide it to others. Ultimately, kind of what I want to make sure is that we have a good kind of view for the future. We have the opportunity to lay down the line and kind of project what our future is going to look like for our audiences, whoever they may be. And so it was helpful.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That is a great way to officially end our program today, but I wanted to just stress we're going to hang out for a while. I know Adam said he can hang out for a little bit longer. Blair might have to go get ready for her podcast tonight. But so as people are trickling out, I'm going to open one more poll, which hopefully you can type in, Tanya. I didn't screw it up this time.
Nope, this time it's good.
So as you know, we would have been meeting in person if things were different. So one idea we had was to have a reunion of people who are actually here today, get together and share ideas, post-corona, when we can actually be in the same room together. So I was thinking it would be fun to share ideas, can we get together and have an ice cream social and talk and actually meet each other in person? So feel free to share any ideas you have, and we'll save those. And then with that, you are officially dismissed. Thank you, and look for follow-up. Again, if you didn't register via Eventbrite, I may or may not have your email as an attendee, and so please send me an email just to remind me. And then if you want to hang around, turn on your camera, turn on your mic. We can hang out and chat for a little. Maybe I'll go get a beer. I don't know. So thank you, everyone, for coming. And
thank you.
Thank you all so much for your presentations. The whole day was a wealth of information. So thank you all.